On April 17th, 2022, the trumpet world lost an all time legend in Mr. Bob Reeves. Bob was much more than just a mouthpiece manufacturer. In fact, even if you've never played a Bob Reeves mouthpiece, you have been influenced and impacted by his work. Bob was an innovator, he was a meticulous craftsman, and he set the standard that most modern manufacturers are trying to live up to. Now, I didn't know Bob personally, but I do know how much of an impact he had on the industry because of several of my good friends and Trumpet Guru guests. So, what I thought I would do is to take a moment to talk to a few of them about how Bob impacted them in the way they've approached their careers and how that has inevitably impacted each of us. So let's start with Chris Cromer. Chris is a good friend. As a matter of fact, he is my personal technician. He is a great repair person, and Bob was a great influence on him in his understanding of concepts such as valve alignments. So Chris is going to share his insights and what Bob meant to him and how he feels Bob's legacy will continue to impact the trumpet community as a whole.
But no, Bob was great, man. I always, he's one of the old Macs, I mean, going back, I would say he might be one of the first to really apply finer technology, beyond, the basics and copying things and people kind of doing what everybody's always done. I mean, everybody kind of, somebody gets hip to something or the new standard is set as far as how an instrument is designed. A lot of people kind of follow that, but I think he was the first one to really kind of apply a more fine-tooth comb to things in my eye. And in modern era, let's just say like the last, since the 20th century per se. But yeah, I mean, he really found a way to peel another 10 layers off the onion. And really was, I remember I always tell people this when I talk about him, is that he told me how he was a machinist in the Navy and how if I recall, if I'm remembering this correctly, his bench test he had to make a steel block and it had to be, perfect. And you think that's easy, just square, but it's like when you're talking about tens of thousands of an inch, and they're going to measure it with every little mic they got. And that was his thing. So, he really applied that to the trumpet world and then just, to him, it has to be perfect. It's like this comes in here, this goes to here, this has to be perfect. And he was able to kind of make that repeatable. But he was always just so willing, he's kind of an exemplar of like what I love about this industry, that most people are very open and are interested almost to a fault of talking to people about their what they do and their ideas and sharing the knowledge. Terry's another great example of that, of just, aggressively interested in just helping people get that next generation, or just sharing that knowledge and just kind of not going, oh, well, I don't want to tell you that. That's a trade secret, or I can't, is there any secrets really? Or is it just glorified plumbing kind of thing? And he was always I could talk to him about anything. I remember all the different shows, and a couple of times we were even, table neighbors at a couple conferences, and just he would just talk for hours about anything. Just when I was trying to kind of dice into valve alignments and figure out all of that and its relevance, and he would talk to you and tell you anything. He was never somebody who was looking around for the conversation to be over, like looking over your shoulder for someone cooler to talk to. He was always zeroed in on the conversation, and I always that really stands out to me.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. And yeah, one of the things you said is kind of interesting is like there are a lot of artists in the world of mouthpiece manufacturing and things like that. I've heard stories like about Dominic Calicchio, and who kind of just everything was just kind of by hand, and that's cool. That's really cool. But where Bob, like you're saying, he was kind of the first person to take that old world craftsmanship and apply like more modern machining and those super tight tolerances that that he had to do as a machinist, taking that and bringing that into the mix. So kind of getting the best of both the science and the art of making pieces. So that
Right.
was really kind of cool. And like, so we had the, he did the mouthpieces, the sleeves, I don't know if anybody was doing that before Bob, or how that came about. And, the valve alignments, became a big thing. So, yeah, he definitely left an impression on the world of trumpet playing.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd have to. I can't say for sure, but I have a pretty good idea that you mentioned. The sleeves and how to mitigate gap in the mouthpiece. I'm pretty sure that was his brainchild, because I know in reading Reynolds Schilke's research, at least, I mean, for a long time, it was considered a mistake if you had a gap between the end of the mouthpiece and the beginning of the lead pipe. Because, if you bought a Schilke, you bought it with a Schilke mouthpiece. You bought a Bach, it came with a Bach mouthpiece, and they all fit. And then when people started doing aftermarket lead pipes, that relationship and the movement changed. And people went, oh, there's a space there. That's a mistake. And he was the one to go, well, it has an impact on how this horn responds. So instead of eliminating it, let's use this as a point of adjustment and a point of resistance to regulate how this horn plays. And I mean, obviously, that was a game changer in the way the gap works, with everything from his sleeves to adjustable gap receivers, or just being aware of that when you're trying to problem solve. So I like I say, I'm pretty sure he was the one that spearheaded that whole thing of using that as a tool instead of eliminating it as a mistake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's really kind of a cool concept, when you start really diving into the science of the horn, and understanding those points of resistance, the how you can make these subtle changes to the structure of the horn, or the those different resistance points, and create a more efficient or a slightly different sounding horn. And so instead of just having to go out and buy a new horn every time, but which is okay if you're a horn manufacturer. But so when you think about like these kind of concepts, I mean, like for me, when I see somebody has done something that's like new and innovative and stuff like that, I'm immediately like, that's really cool. And then I start thinking about, well, why didn't I think of that? And then my next thought is usually like, okay, well then, how could I take this idea and maybe build on it, or adjust it or adopt it? So, did any of these ideas that Bob brought into the picture, have they impacted you in the way you approach, you're working on horns?
Yeah, I mean, at very least with playing. I mean, when I was in college, the mouthpiece that I chose, I mean, while it was a Warburton and not one of Bob's mouthpieces, it was, the gap in there definitely was something that, between myself and my trumpet professor, was something we paid attention to. And the backbore I picked was, adjusted for that, because I had a bend, so I needed something that kind of took up a little bit more space, so I could have a little bit more of a gap in there. Since I was in college, I was a lead player, or posing as a lead player, I guess, and I needed a little bit more, resistance in that spot to anchor the upper register. So it was, applying it in that way. And I would just say, in general, professionally, just having, talking to someone and bouncing ideas off them, and seeing what sticks, and what some feedback somebody might give to you, especially somebody like Bob, is going to, cause you to fortify what you know. Like you're going to either throw away the bad ideas, or you're going to fortify what you know and make you think of another way to look at it. And because he was so willing to talk, openly, it was a real way to kind of just refine your thing, just through conversation, of just absorbing the knowledge. It's hard to pinpoint it, I guess, on any one particular point. I guess I talked to him most about valve alignment, just because that's what he's known for. So when I started, thinking maybe I should offer that, he was one of the first people I talked to about that, to kind of get his perspective. So,
Yeah. Well, and that was another thing I wanted to ask you about, because valve alignment was not something that I had heard a whole lot about when I was, coming up the ranks as a player. And it was probably not until the early 2000s that I even heard that term. And, with typical, that combination of, wanting some trumpet voodoo, and and also being skeptical about it, and I, so, diving a little bit, and I had an alignment done, and the horn did definitely play different. So, from as a from your perspective as a technician, um, what is the advantage you see of valve alignments, and what are some of the concepts that Bob helped you to understand, to help you be a better person for doing those kind of jobs?
It really opens your eye to how imperfect a lot of these things are made. A lot of people make instruments and a lot of them do a good job, but there's just things where I guess the higher volume you do, the more, mistakes or misgivings are going to be in the instrument and how it's put together. And just kind of looking at even just the simplest thing as felts and how they adjust the alignment, or even the rotational alignment if the spring barrels are not correctly soldered in. That was actually, in a way, thinking about it, not him directly, but in a roundabout way, his concepts of how he looked at things being, all these adjustment points of, didn't know this, and kind of shedding light on these things and diving into those things is kind of where I came from with that, because I realized that some of the instruments were just not made well. And I'm just like, why is it made like that? Like, realizing the simple little things that just you never questioned, like felts or corks and things like that, and the way that the nodal points struck on things, and the seams in the horn. And he really thought a lot about that kind of stuff. So, yeah, without him really cracking those eggs open, I don't know that it would have occurred to many, because again, so much of what we do is kind of like, rudimentary, where, you just kind of do, you do what's asked of you. You do what you within what you know. And he was kind of bringing, I guess, discomfort to that, of like, well, no, here's a different way to look at it, and trying to do something different with it. So, I had met him probably going back to the late 90s when I first started going to conferences. And he's definitely one of the people I would talk to just going around, even before I started my business, to, hey, like, let me ask you about this, or just, getting information that kind of inspires some type of thought about the direction of it. Like, as I'm shaping how I even think about things. So, I mean, that's probably broader, I guess, than you would want. But I mean, I don't know. For me, I don't know. Would I have even gotten into this if it wasn't for somebody like Bob Reeves that made it interesting and made people think critically about the instrument, because that's how I thought about it. And if there's not somebody else doing that, then you go, I don't know what I'm thinking. No one else is doing this. I'm probably wrong. But
Yeah.
then you talk to somebody like him, and you're like, no, this guy's thinking the same thing. And then, like, tell me more about that. And then he tells you something. You're like, oh, I was thinking of that, and I thought it was a, good or bad idea. And then he tells you he already ran all the experiments, and then you can throw it away or you can go forward with it. So, yeah, just the tone he set. I mean, because obviously he far precedes almost everybody in the business. So it's hard to think how far back his way of thinking and what he did really set up a lot of things that I wasn't even thinking of when I first started.
Yeah. So, I mean, from your perspective, what do you see as being kind of the legacy that Bob has laid down, and how can we pay that forward? How can we keep it going?
I would say, like, the first thing, just the fact that he was so willing to talk to people and willing to share the information. There's, I guess, limits to everything, as far as just like, there's almost so much time in the day. But, the fact that he was so willing and open and open to talk to people about things and kind of help bring up that next generation of, technicians or manufacturers, I think that's the biggest thing. He was so easy going about that stuff. And, you hope that that's not one of those things that gets shut, where people become more closed off and not wanting to talk to people. And, you want to keep things open. You want people to be able to learn and kind of kick ideas around and things. And I think he really I think he did that almost better than anybody, of just setting that tone of having that kind of environment, you know. I mean, it's not a technical legacy, but I think that's important, because without that, who else is learning anything? Who's getting inspired? Who's even that's thinking about getting into a business or has an idea? You know, if somebody like that that's willing to talk to them and entertain it goes a long way. I mean, I'm sure you could make a family tree of all the different people that he's influenced or even directly mentored, and I'm sure it's massive. You know?
Yeah, well, that's true.
For years, Bob was considered to be the oldest living mouthpiece maker. Well, now that Bob's gone, that title has been passed, and it's been passed to his good friend of several decades, Mr. Terry Warburton. Terry has been in the business for a long time and has worked with Giardinelli and then formed his own company, Warburton Music Products. Over the years, Terry and Bob have had a very, very good relationship and would often spend hours talking trade business and just life in general with each other. So let's hear from Terry in his own words the impact that Bob has made on him as a mouthpiece manufacturer and what he sees Bob's ongoing legacy as being.
And so when did you first meet Bob, or when did your path?
Oh boy, I'll tell you what. I remember going to his little shop in Ridgewood or Hollywood, whatever the heck it was. I want to say it was back in the mid '80s, maybe, probably mid '80s. And so I met him then. Very nice gentleman. He was very gracious to me at the time, showed me everything he's doing, and he knew what I was doing, that I was, quote, a competitor. But I mean, Bob was much like me. It's like, we're not competitors. We're in the same business. We don't feel like we're competing against each other. You know what I mean? None of us feel that way, really. Well, there's probably one or two guys that feel that way, but I'm not one of them.
Yeah.
I just feel like we're all in the same industry, and it's a small industry. I mean, it's a pretty short list of characters, and it just got a little shorter with Bob leaving the scene. And I'm happy that I've had a chance to, I met Vincent Bach. I knew Reno Schilke fairly well. Of course, I knew Bob Giardinelli really, really well. And I got to meet Zatola, mouthpiece maker. When I met him, I went to his shop, nothing going on. The guy says, oh, he's down at the boatyard working on his boat. And I went, oh, my kind of guy.
There you go.
It was funny. I showed him, I told him who I was. He goes, yeah, I heard about you. And I showed him a mouthpiece, and he goes, well, I see you're not here to learn about how to make a mouthpiece, so what do you want to talk about? And Al Cass, I spent a very nice day with Al. Sold a lot of his pieces back in the 70s. Alberto Castanelli was his name, by the way.
Well, I did not know that, so there's a little nugget of wisdom that you're passing along. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the one thing that I did definitely hear about Bob, and that when this opportunity came up, I immediately thought about you, because I knew how you talked to Bob during the off and on during the years. Anytime we were at a show or something like that, you guys would do your little hangs and stuff. But it's that attitude of we have knowledge to share with other people and to make the trumpet world a little bit better place, and
happy to do it.
Yeah, and Bob had that reputation. You have that reputation, and there are a few others that are kind of the lightweight, and some are just kind of like doing heads down doing their thing. But it seemed like you and Bob both kind of had that mentality of being willing to go the extra mile with people if they're really earnestly looking for some assistance or some guidance or insight into the industry. You guys both were very good about that. So like when you first met Bob, that was back the 80s, man. That was kind of a heyday in LA for him.
Oh yeah, he was busy. Yeah, he was the place to go. He was the guy.
Yeah. And it's just funny how those cycles go, it's like, like you said, working in Giardinelli. for all those years. So the East Coast and then East Coast West Coast thing. But with Bob, some of the people that that I know that have relationships with him during the years or impact over the years, they talk about his kind of taking the art of mouthpiece manufacturing and adding a little extra science to it. That precision that he had as a machinist. That he started to think about things that other people weren't necessarily thinking were possible because of their technical limitations. They had the imagination, but not the technical chops to pull it off.
Right.
So, were there any things that he did that kind of that gave you a springboard for the stuff that you were later on in your career?
I'd like to say yes, but not really. I mean, Bob was, doing his thing and, excuse me, with the screw rims and sleeves and stuff like that. But, that stuff had been done. I mean, Giardinelli had a 5-piece mouthpiece back when I was there in '79. So there was nothing kind of like new under the sun. I think Bob was just a meticulous craftsman, which, I have to respect that. I mean, any time I see somebody that's really not just gifted at what they do, but really loves what they do, enjoys it every day, and wants to do it the right way. And that was the way Bob was. He was showing me all about how he does his heat treating of his tooling and stuff like that. I mean, he was just a great guy and very, not just informative, but that's the right word, just gracious. That's the best word. But I'm just glad that, I flew out there for Bob's 45th anniversary of his company. It was funny because, I show up and he's like, "Oh, what are you doing in LA?" I said, "This." He goes, "Well, when are you going home?" I went, "Tomorrow morning." And then I did it once again for his 90th birthday, just not that many months ago. And it was nice. I got to hang out, not just at the shop because his health was already failing. So we spent some time at the shop, but then we went back to his house and met his brother, Al, very nice gentleman. And Bob, Al, and me, sat around and listened to Bob's absolutely unbelievable stereo system, by the way. It was, Bob had to show off. It was like, sit right here, sit right there. You put on a CD. I was just like, really? Is that what a lot of money spent on a stereo system really sounds like?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's better than earbuds any day.
Better than the speakers in your pickup truck. So,
well, no, not really. I got an F-150. It's got a pretty good system.
Oh, okay. Well, that's cool. But yeah, I mean, Bob, I think Bob definitely left a legacy in so many different ways, in terms of, some of the ways that he was able, like you said, there's nothing new under the sun, but just kind of the way he had that kind of meticulous approach to things kind of set a standard for other manufacturers to kind of adhere to.
Or rise up to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and look what he did with like valve alignments and stuff, like getting that dialed in, to 1,000th of an inch, upstroke, downstroke, side stroke, I mean, no one else was really doing that and taking it to that level that Bob did. And everybody who's ever had a Bob Reeves valve alignment knows it's a difference. I mean? It's like factories, that are mass producing stuff can only get it so close. They don't take the extra time, the extra half an hour of fiddling and farting around with getting it absolutely right. And Bob was a genius at that stuff, no doubt about it. And I'm sure that, Bob or Snell, who's taken it over, has been the recipient of some wonderful knowledge. And I'm sure that he's going to, do really well with the business because he's been there a number of years already. And I'm sure he's going to take it and do fine with it. I certainly chatted with him already and wished him well. And there's nothing I can do to help them. You know what I'm saying? It's like they've got everything under control. Bob's finally got some good CNC computerized equipment. Of course, when Bob and I started, CNC what?
Yeah.
It's like, here's a manual machine. You know how to make that thing work? you know, and it's like, but everybody's, you know, gotten like to, you know, more and better equipment. All the manufacturers, you know, really around the world, their ability to precision machine items, whether it's parts for trumpet, you know, like we're manufacturing a lot of the parts and pieces, you know, and I was very flattered to just work with Steve Shires was down here for a whole week, and we machined all the parts and pieces for his trombone slide assembly, you know, the hand grip area and everything. And, you know, like you said, it's like, you know, 20 years ago, you couldn't get parts like that machined like that good, or that consistent, you know, where every one of them coming off the machine is checked and it's like, yeah, that one's perfect, next. And it was fun, but it's fun that we're able to, at this point in the industry, really make some good stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and Bob, I think, saw that coming and was, you know, he understood it and he was all in favor of it. You know, I mean, doing everything manually and by hand is all well and good, but one at a time is not a business. You know, I mean, it's a hobby.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, there's that level of inconsistency with it. I mean, even when you're trying to be as meticulous as possible, when you're doing that many, it's kind of hard to, you know, if you're doing it by hand, there's a greater margin of error.
Oh yeah, it's virtually impossible to get it. I mean, even working with some of this computerized equipment, if you're not babysitting and paying attention, my friend Mike Padula, the trumpet player machinist that taught me about computerized machining, he said it best. He goes, Terry, these machines can make a lot of really good parts and they can make a lot of really bad parts. He said, don't ever trust that it's going to be fine. And just a short story, I remember once at my old shop, had the machine running automatically, making trumpet tops out of a 4-foot bar. It was running like 40 pieces at a time, or 41 or whatever it was. And I'm sitting out in the backyard, sun tanning. It was this Saturday. I'm listening to the machine. I'm thinking, isn't this wonderful, right? And I hear the machine finally stopped after an hour and a half, whatever it was. I go inside. Well, about 3 parts in, the threading tool broke. So I had a whole bunch of trumpet top blanks with no threads. And I thought, yeah, Mike, you were right.
You were right. Yeah.
Like a lot of good parts, you can make a lot of bad parts.
Yeah, it's kind of like you got that marriage of the technology, which makes it easier for us to do stuff. Then you've got the innovation, you know, the creativity to figure out how to use the machinery and to use it in a better way, or, you know,
right.
to help, you know, they work together synergistically. So, you know, when the limitations of what you can accomplish are taken away by that process, that it frees you up to do that much more. And
yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, like the saxophone neck that I invented, it's like, you know, the summer people looked at it and they're like, wow, it figures a trumpet player would figure out how to fix this thing. The reality is, you guys never had the kind of equipment to be able to do the things that I'm doing with it. You just kept banging out sax necks like you have for the last 150 years because that's the way we always did it, without thinking that, you know, maybe just because this was the way it was 100 years ago doesn't really make it right.
Yeah.
You know, and that's how I've always approached it. Like the slot receiver that we put on our trumpets now, it's like, what, nobody thought of that? Well, I guess not, because that's not how it was done.
Yeah.
You know, and so, yeah, like you just said, you know, now that we have the equipment that can precision make parts like that, it opens up your mind to say, well, what can I do with this?
Yeah.
You know, how can I look at this and say, wow, I could make a part that's better than, you know, what came off a steel mandrel inconsistently, you know, for the last 150 years.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's just like when you were saying about like Bob and the valve alignment. You know, for every trumpet that's coming out, even though they're great trumpets, you know, sometimes because of the mass manufacturing, as you said, the tolerances may not be exactly the way that they were intended to be. And just having someone to have the not even the insight, just the common sense to go, you know, this is a problem, and sure, the horn's going to play okay, but it's not going to be able to be played at its highest level if this isn't addressed. So here's a solution to this problem. So
well, that's the gift. That's the gift that Bob had, is like he saw that it was a problem, but he had the wisdom to know how to fix it, and how to fix it consistently. You know, with shims that are like 1/1000th of an inch thick, like the skinniest piece of cellophane in the world, but every one of them makes a difference in the actual final analysis. And I think, you know, and Bob had that vision that, like, not just here's the problem, but here's how I can fix the problem.
Yeah.
You know, and then he ran with that, and God bless. I mean, he how many trumpets has he done over the years? Good God.
Well,
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I had an old Colicchio that I got a valve alignment on, and I was amazed at how it changed. Not just the action of the valves, but the intonation, the way the horn slotted was just different, completely different.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's not like voodoo. It's actually a mechanically correct way to do the thing.
Right.
And
yeah,
that was one of Bob's gifts for sure.
Yeah, because you're talking about, you know, especially, you know, you talk about your embouchure, you know, the difference between, you know, being able to play a low C and a double high C isn't, you know, this much. You know, it's microns of a difference, you know, in the size of your aperture to do that. So, you know, everything about playing the trumpet is about very, very strict tolerances and adjustments in those. And I think sometimes, you know, we lose sight of that in the manufacturing process. Some people lose sight because it's mass production versus really high quality control. And when you can get that in line together, the quality control, the mass production, and the innovation, the willingness to try and find a new way to do things, and I think that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, I mean, what you were just saying, I tell people, I said, I'm in the only industry where 1/1000th of an inch is about this big. You know, and I mean, in terms of some of the people, like, the mouthpiece is 2/1000ths bigger. What's 2/1000ths? It's like 2/3 of one of these hairs is 2/1000ths of an inch. I said, and yes, that made a difference. You know, and I mean, how many other industries are like that? I mean, you know, people say, well, you're not, you know, making a rocket ship or anything. It's like, no, we're a little more precise than that.
And being down there in Florida, you would know all about that.
Man, we just had a launch yesterday or this morning or whatever. I think SpaceX has sent up 4 rockets this month.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we hear it all the time. You know, everything starts rumbling, the windows start shaking. And we're miles away from, you know, we're 15 miles as the crow flies. And yet you still feel when those rockets go up.
Yeah, it's a lot of power. A lot of power.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, what if you had to, like, kind of encapsulate what you see Bob's influence on the trumpet world as being, like the legacy that he's leaving for the current generation, you know, people like you, or the up and coming generation of manufacturers? What do you see as the legacy that he's leaving for others to aspire to?
I think he was really the first guy to really concentrate on consistent quality. And that's something that we all have to emulate, you know, and try to achieve in our day-to-day manufacturing. You know, we're forever like checking parts, and, you know, everywhere you turn in the shop, we've got a dial caliper that, you know, that measures a 1/1000th of an inch just to check everything. I know the first time I went to a machine shop, you know, when I started doing mouthpieces, I had a drawing of what I wanted to make. And the guy looks at me and he goes, all right, that dimension's 0.453, 453 thousandths. I'm like, yeah. And he goes, plus or minus how much? I went, what? Plus or minus? No, 453. And being a machinist, he's like, okay, here's how this world really works. Plus or minus 10,000s is one price. Plus or minus 2,000s is a lot higher price. Plus or minus no thousands? He goes, that's really hard. And I was so clueless. I'm like, well, no, 453. That's the size it should be. So when people start here at the shop, like even these young kids, when I show them a part and I measure it, I don't tell them anything about plus or minus. Here's the part, and it has to be 453 thousandths. That's actually the part on the backboard that we inscribed the name. Mm-hmm. Because once it's being held in the chuck, if it's less or more than that, it changes how it holds it. So it's like, no, it's 453. You know, and that's the thing. I think that Bob was really one of the first to take it to that level. You know, we're like, for example, the sleeves that he makes, they have to be perfect. They're not close, they're not sloppy, they don't leak air, they're right. And I mean, even now, if when we try to make some sleeves to fit on Reeves mouthpieces, that's a bitch. You know, and it's like, no, it's got to be right. It's got to be slip fit, perfect, airtight, like a damn trumpet piston. You know, that's the right way to do it. And Bob had that all figured out.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's going to be missed. He's I think a positive influence in the mouthpiece world. He wasn't selling voodoo. He wasn't selling this week's magic high note mouthpiece. You know, he never did any of that. He simply made a good quality product. He had players go to him, as we do here. They tell him, you know, it's like, well, what don't you like about the one you've got now? And let me see if I can do something that fixes that. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. That's how I ended up getting Rosalino playing on one of our pieces. I bet him I could make one that played better than his. And he looked at me and goes, well, I played this one here for 22 years. What do you think you can do? And I went, well, if I can't do anything, then you don't have to pay anything. He went, all right, I'll come by your shop. And when I finished, he walked out and he goes, you're right. Yours plays better. And here's my old mouthpiece. I have 22 years. You hold on to it. And I still have that piece, by the way. Very flattering to have a guy like that at the end of the session say, yeah, you're right. It's better.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of level that Bob took the industry to, that forced everybody else along.
Yeah.
Because if you weren't going to do it, someone else was going to do it.
Yeah.
And I think it's, like I said, I think he was a positive, original influence, even more so than Bach or Chopin or Giardinelli, who they were also made mouthpieces. But Bob that was him. That's what he did. And he did it really well.
Everyone in the industry had to start small, and Bob was no exception. What started out as a one-man operation eventually grew, much in part to the help of our final guest on this episode, Mr. K.O. Siknsnes. K.O. started out as a customer, became a friend, and then an employee of Bob. And in this discussion, K.O. is going to share a little bit about the process of helping Bob to grow his business, the impact that Bob's methodology and work ethic has had on him, and a lot of great anecdotes. So I hope you enjoy this segment. So KO, you have a long history with Bob, and I'm really grateful for you taking some time with us. But can you give me kind of some backstory of how you two met and the relationship and how he was a part of your life and what that meant to you?
Sure, I'll try to make a long story medium.
Okay.
So the first time I ever heard of Bob Reeves was probably in 1975. I was living in Hawaii, and Johnny Madrid came over. People don't know who Johnny Madrid was. He was an amazing trumpet player, and there's actually a video I did on my personal channel about him, which is pretty cool if people want to check it out. Anyway, Johnny was in Hawaii, and he told me, he says, you got to get a Bob Reeves mouthpiece. And I go, okay, who's Bob Reeves? And he started describing it to me, and I was a kid then, And I started talking to other trumpet players. Oh yeah, Bob Reeves. So in the beginning, to me, Bob Reeves was a guru, a mouthpiece guru in a far off land, Los Angeles. And back then, you know, Bob was in Hollywood at his shop. I don't even know if he had a secretary at that time, but so I tried to call, and I placed an order for the mouthpiece I thought I wanted. And I waited 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months, and I'm not getting this mouthpiece. And I'm asking Johnny, I go, man, am I ever going to get this mouthpiece? He goes, well, he goes, that's kind of how it is. Bob's really busy and he's a one-man shop. And if you go there, he takes care of you. And so that's why, you know, other things, you know, he was a custom mouthpiece maker. He wasn't trying to set up a business, you know, to make $1 million. He was trying to make custom mouthpieces for guys. So finally, Johnny went back to LA and went to the shop and got my mouthpiece and brought it back. So that's how I first learned about Bob Reeves and knew about him. He was this guru in a far off land. And then I came to visit LA and I got to go there. And did you ever go to a shop in Hollywood?
I was never fortunate enough to do that.
So it was a really small shop, very small shop. And it was very long and narrow. And you'd walk in the front door and there was this little tiny waiting area. And in front of you was a door that was locked. And to your left was a little window with a sliding glass. So you go in there, and if you're KO from Hawaii, you're in the front room and you don't know what to do, right? Do you knock? What do you do? Then after a little while, at that point, he did have a secretary and she came to the window. What do you want? Blah, blah, blah. But you didn't get to go in the back. You know, that was for Doc Severinsons of the world and, you know, people that, at least that's how I perceived it. And I was kind of afraid, you know, and then at some point, Bob would come to the window and he was a very soft spoken man and very, no, what do you want? Blah, blah, blah. And then he'd go back and do the work and come back and you'd pay and you'd leave. And then when I moved to Los Angeles after college, I went there and I kind of talked to him some more and we became friends. And eventually I got to be one of those guys that got to go behind, you know, the door and hang out. And that's when we really became friends. And we would go to lunch sometimes, but I was really a customer. But I was fascinated by what he knew and his machining, and he had a lot of anecdotes about the world. And so we became friends. And then I was trying to make a living as a trumpet player, but working at managing a music store. And that was going south because the owner and I had different ideas about, you know, how things should go and this and that. So I'm looking around for what can I do? And I always thought Bob was sort of the unsung hero of everything, because here he was doing this great work, this innovative work, was very helpful, but I just didn't feel enough people knew about him. And so I thought, man, he could use some help and I could use a new job. So I started talking to him about it. And, you know, there's some things that made sense. I had some marketing skills and computer skills. And so eventually, to be honest, he hired me on, and he couldn't afford to hire me on because he had another secretary and he had Jose was working for him part-time, but he did it, I think, to help me out. And then it grew from there. We did some marketing, started getting more successful. And then we moved up to Valencia. It's a larger shop, and we hired some more people. They're still there today. And then in 2008, after we had worked together with the guys at Stomvie on the V Raptor trumpet, that was a project between Vicente at Stomvie, Bob Reeves, Carlos Morales, who's my partner today, and myself on the V Raptor. I'd been studying acoustics, and I kind of wanted to explore a different direction. And I remember sitting in the front room with Bob one day talking about stuff, and he says, you should go explore what you want to do. And so with his blessing, you know, I came over to Stomvie. And so that was sort of the end of our professional relationship, because I wasn't working with him anymore, but we remained friends. But even though the shop's only about 7 or 8 miles from here, it's the way life is nowadays, I'd see him when I see you, once or twice a year at a show.
Right.
Was that too long and rambling?
Oh, absolutely not. No. Yeah, I mean, it's funny how, you know, when we get to these points in our lives when our paths start to kind of diverge a little bit, even though you have the best intentions of, you know, staying in touch and stuff like that, you know, life just kind of starts taking on its own rhythm. And a lot of times, you know, people that will, sometimes we see people that live halfway across the country more than we see someone who lives down the block from us.
I know, it's weird, huh?
Yeah. But yeah, the one thing that always struck me about Bob, and is part of the reason I wanted to do this episode, is kind of a tribute to him, is yeah, I didn't know him well, you know, personally, you know, just kind of the casual meet at one of the hangs at one of the conferences. But what always struck me about him, and what everyone has confirmed, is that he was just always willing to share insights and inspiration, and, you know, to provide some level of support, moral support to people to follow their dreams, and to you know, to give them some encouragement to forge their path. So like when you were working with him, were there like any instances that pop up in your head where, I mean, obviously the one where you're just talking about, where he kind of said, you know, you need to follow your mission. Do you have any times where you can kind of point to and say, yeah, you know, this was like a perfect example of the mentor Bob, you know, and how he approached that aspect of his profession?
A perfect example, maybe not, but I mean, so Bob, by the time I got to know him as a friend and then to work with him, by that time, Bob had figured out a lot of stuff as far as mouthpieces and trumpets and trumpet players and all that kind of stuff. So he had strong opinions about it. And I think in the world, a lot of times people with strong opinions are thought to be arrogant, but I don't believe that's the case. If you have a strong opinion and you can back it up with, hey, the reason I believe this is because of this, the other person doesn't have to agree with you, but doesn't mean that someone's arrogant. So Bob did have strong opinions. And I remember sometimes the guys would come in and Bob, you know, come in and just drill this mouthpiece out. Well, he didn't want to just do that unless he could explain to them what he knew and what might happen. Because once you drill the mouthpiece out, you're not undrilling it. And I remember one day he'd talked to somebody for quite a while, and he said, yeah, he goes, I know that guy was getting bored. His eyes were rolling back and forth. He says, but I don't ever want someone to come back a month later and say, hey, you didn't tell me that. So he was always, like you said, giving. He wanted to tell people what he knew, not to say, hey, look what I know, but it was to help them play better. Because ultimately, if you're working in this business, you're not doing it to be a millionaire. Trust me. You're doing it because you love the trumpet. You love trumpet players. Well, not all trumpet players. No, you love trumpet players. And you really want to help them, because when you go to hear them play, you want to enjoy the concert. And if you helped a little bit for that, boy, it's a very satisfying feeling. And I know Bob felt that way all the time. I remember in that period where I was, you know, exploring whether I could get a job with him, you know, I was there hanging out one day on my day off from the music store, and I was in the back, and there was some guy up front playing, you know, trying mouthpieces. And this guy sounded horrible. I mean, it was painful to listen. It was just so bad. I don't know who it was. It was just horrible. And I remember looking at Bob and saying, how can you handle this? And he looked at me and he says, you never know when the light's going to come on. He says, that guy doesn't sound so good today, but he might sound like Lynn Nicholson next week, or Doc Severinsen. He goes, so you got to treat everybody the same way, give them the same information, and then they make the decisions. Everyone comes in with a problem. You know, they want to play higher, they want to sound better, they want to do this, they want to do that. And Bob truly wanted to solve their problem. And it didn't matter if he made a dime or 100 dimes. It didn't matter. He wanted, because he's a problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
He was, you know, he was trained in the Navy as a machinist at China Lake. He was a real machinist. I mean, they were making rocket nozzles you know, test rocket nozzles that would take a month to make. And in machining, you talk about tolerances, you know, how much plus or minus, and they'd be working at, you know, -0 plus 50 millionths of an inch. And he'd spend a month working on these rocket nozzles. Then he'd put them on the test rig and blow them up in 10 minutes. So when he got out of that and went to work at Lockheed and stuff, he was an incredible machinist and a trumpet player. So then I think it was Lockheed he was working at, and he quit Lockheed because he didn't like what was going on there. And he went to work for Carol Purviance. And I have a little treat for you if you'd like to see it. So in preparation for this, I started going through some of my archives.
Okay.
And I found some unreleased video of Bob Reeves. And I cut together a short little thing. It's about 1.5 minutes.
Okay.
Of him explaining, starting when he went to work for Carol Purviance, making mouthpieces, and what ensued in the next year or so. Would you like to see it?
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay, here we go. If I can make this work, everything should be good.
Because of my background, I was able to understand and do the machine work that Purviance needed to make mouthpieces. But as time went on, and he wasn't capable of working with players, I had to start working with him. And I realized after a while that I didn't have any answers at all to help these players who came in looking for anything. And I didn't know how to interpret or provide what they were looking for. And so then I realized I didn't know anything. That I could do machine work really great, but I didn't know anything about mouthpieces and trumpets. And that's where I really started to explore and keep track and measure all kinds of equipment and sit down and look at the information. And at the time I started, I was seeing some of the finest players maybe ever in the world coming to get help. And I shortly knew that I couldn't tell them to go home and practice. I had to provide something on the spot, because many of them were going to work around the corner of Paramount Studio. They just stopped in looking for some help before they went to work. I couldn't give them a product or anything that wasn't going to work that day.
So, I mean, that shows a lot about Bob, because it shows his humility. And I remember him telling me that story a little bit differently, that he said, I went to work for Carol Purviance, and in 45 minutes, I was making mouthpieces. Because making a mouthpiece is a lot easier than making a rocket nozzle.
Mm-hmm.
But he said 1.5 years later, the light came on that I hadn't made a mouthpiece yet. He'd made a bunch of parts, but he hadn't solved a problem.
Right.
And,
right.
you know, that again, it shows his inquisitiveness, his humility. So it was here he was, like he described, he's on Ridgewood Place, and Paramount Studios was right around the corner. And this is in the mid-70s. This is when there were a lot of studio gigs, a lot going on, a lot of trumpet players. And when he's talking about some of the greatest trumpet players, you know, he's talking about Chuck Finley and, you know, Jerry Hay and Gary Grant and all these guys. And they'd come in and he'd make them a mouthpiece or adjust a mouthpiece. Hey, this is great. And they'd go to work and it'd be fine. But they'd come back maybe a month later or something, 2 weeks later, and they'd want an adjustment to the mouthpiece. And he'd adjust it, and they'd go away and they'd come back. They want another adjustment. So Bob, wanting to solve problems and being inquisitive, is asking himself, how come the greatest trumpet players in the world are coming here, leaving with a mouthpiece, they sound like Gabriel, and they're coming back a few weeks later and they want a different mouthpiece? It didn't make sense to him because the metal of the mouthpiece isn't changing. So Bob had also worked at Benj Trumpets, so he knew how trumpets were made too. And he started realizing that the only thing that could be changing, other than the mouthpiece or the trumpet getting dirty and the player changing a little bit, was the alignment of the valves, because of the pad material drifting. depending on how much spit or oil's on it or what the temperature's like. And that's when he started experimenting with valve alignment, which, you know, is one of the big contributions Bob gave to the trumpet world, is valve alignment. And it's just his inquisitiveness and his scratching his head and his, you know, what can we do better? And that's just how he was, aside from being a lot of fun, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that I think is so interesting to me, is that problem solver mindset. I mean, that maybe it's because I kind of have that same kind of personality, and I like to dive into things and, you know, not just know that something works, but understand why it works, or why it only works in this situation, and becoming very analytical about those things. And, you know, people like Bob, you know, yourself, that freedom of that understanding, and then the willingness to share that wisdom with people, and all with the intent of just helping someone get better at what they're doing, which is to play the trumpet. Because, you know, the more obstacles we can remove from you know, getting our idea out of our head and out the horn, then the more enjoyable the process is. So like for yourself, when you were working with him, how did that impact you in terms of the way that you now approach, how you approach your business, you know, from you know, when you started your own gig with Stomvy?
Well, see, I come from a background. My father was a brilliant pathologist, and he used to teach, you know, 600 level pathology courses and stuff at the University of Hawaii. And he would be he'd have PhD candidates that he worked with. And he used to give PhD exams. Now we're talking about people doing stuff in, you know, biology, right? Pathology and immunology and all that kind of stuff. And they'd come in for oral exams, and he'd ask them questions about architecture. Because he said the point of getting a PhD is not understanding the sex life of a paramecium. The point of being a PhD is being able to solve a problem, whether it's a problem about architecture or plumbing or the trumpet mouthpiece or whatever. So I came with that personality that you described you have, with wanting to be a problem solver and wanting to understand how this stuff works. Now, had I realized how crazy this trumpet thing is, when you start getting, I might have said, what, am I crazy? Let me go work at Tower Records. But so I think Bob and I worked together well as a team, because he certainly had all the machining skills and a lot of knowledge of working with trumpet players by the time I got there. And I fit in with the problem solving thing, and also trying to, well, what can we do to let more people know about you? It's called marketing. And see if other people like your product. Because my whole thing is, if Bob makes a mouthpiece, or I make a mouthpiece, or Terry, any whatever, mouthpiece or trumpet, I don't know if you, Jose, are going to like it. I just want you to try it. If you try it and you don't like it, okay, you tried it. So my goal at Bob's was, let's get more people to be aware of what's going on here, and let's raise the bar. Right? If you raise the bar in the industry, the only thing that happens is we get better players and better music. And ultimately, it's about better music, right? Because ultimately, whatever we do, it's for the audience. If we don't have an audience, we don't have a job.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Yeah, and you know, you said, yeah, like you mentioned the, you know, like the Jerry Hayes, Chuck Finley's, Gary Grant's popping into the shop. Being in the LA area, you know, Johnny Madrid, phenomenal player. If anybody is not hip to Johnny, definitely check out some of the work that he did. And KO, that little documentary thing that you have is, I've watched it a few times. It's great stuff. But
and it's got Bob Reeves in it.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, who are some of the other people that would just, you know, you would see kind of passing through the Reeves shop from time to time?
You know, Doc was there, of course. I got a couple Canadian brass stories that come to mind if you want to hear those.
Sure, absolutely. Okay. What's the exchange rate on Canadian brass stories these days?
What's that?
What's the exchange rate on the Canadian brass stories?
I have no idea. I'm not sure how many Bitcoins it is, but well, so two come to mind. One of them was Ronnie Rom came in and Bob was going to make him a mouthpiece. And Bob and I were both going to go hear him at the Ambassador Auditorium. So Bob said, okay, I'll finish the mouthpiece and I'll bring it to the gig. Okay, fine. So Bob and I drove separately. And I remember I was sitting in the audience on this side and Bob was sitting on the aisle on the other side. And the Canadian brass, would often walk in through the audience to start the show. And we went separate, but we both got there kind of late. So Bob's sitting in the aisle and the brass starts playing and they start walking down the aisle. And as Ronnie Rom passes by Bob, he holds his trumpet one-handed and he puts his hand out and Bob puts the mouthpiece in his hand, right? And when he gets a break, he takes the mouthpiece out of his horn, pulls his one in, puts it in and played the whole show on the new mouthpiece.
Oh man, that's a great story.
And the other one was, I was living in Long Beach for most of the time I was working with Bob. It's a long commute. And so I would try to get in early, start around 7, so I could leave at 3 or so and maybe miss traffic, especially if I had a gig on the weekend or something. So it was a Friday and I got there at about 7. I think Bob showed up around 8. And about 5 minutes after 8, they're pounding on the door. And I opened the door and it's Jens Lindemann, Ronnie Rom, and Chuck Dallenbach from Canadian brass. I told these stories out of order. This was the first time I actually met those 3 guys. So they come in at 8 in the morning and Jens has got, a bunch of trumpet cases and Dallenbach's got his tuba and Jens wants 3 or 4 alignments and Dallenbach wants an alignment on his tuba and Ronnie Rom wants a couple custom mouthpieces. And they're playing that night in Cerritos. And so once, Bob figured everything they wanted, Bob looks at me and he says, do you think you can handle the trumpets if I do the trombone alignment and the 2 custom mouthpieces? I go, sure, let's give it a shot. So this is before cell phones. So Bob looks at those guys, they're all friends, and he goes, all right, get out of here. If you want us to get this done, get out of here. And I was going to deliver the horns to the show that night. Okay, fine. Well, again, they didn't know who I was. I'm some guy working with Bob. And they leave all these horns there. So I show up at the artist entrance at like about 5:30 or 6. They got like a 7:30 downbeat. And the 3 of them are outside and they're pacing back and forth and looking at their watches. And one of them smoking a cigarette. I drive up with all the horns and of course they played a great show. Those were the kinds of things that, happened all the time. Just kind of crazy things, and people would come in come in just for lunch. And I mean, name a player back at that time, and some of the best players that came in are the players you never heard of. We all have regional players that are incredible, but they didn't make it famous,
Yeah.
I remember Gary Grant coming in a few times, both in the Hollywood shop and then in the Valencia shop. I mean, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of them before I was working there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like if you're in New York and you go to like Josh Landris's shop, you never know who you're going to run into there.
Right.
There's going to be a high school kid or a college kid in there checking out horns, and then you'll get some of the biggest names in the New York scene, or even globally. They're in town. It's like, okay, we're going to go into the Landry's shop and check out some horns and try some stuff out. So yeah, it has to be really cool to be in that environment where you just never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and you have a lot of days that are just normal days, but every once in a while, there's something that's a lot of fun, and that's part of why we do it.
Yeah, well, and even like when we're at events, that's the thing, that you're at a booth and you have a lot of people that are the average player, and then you have a big name player come up, but it's the attitude of the experienced people, people like Bob, people like you, Terry, and other people that I know really well. it's like, it doesn't matter whether you're, who you are. Every person is treated with respect, and there's a bond, and there's, it's like, oh, you're a trumpet player, and hey, let's have some fun and enjoy ourselves. So I think that's so crucial, and especially even from a business perspective, when you don't set yourself up as being an elitist, that you're just, you're here to provide a service for somebody who loves what they do, and you just want to help them to be able to love it that much more.
Well, sure. I was being at conferences. I remember this one conference, Bob and I, the exhibit's closed for the day. So we're going to go up to our rooms, right? Put our stuff down and go get dinner. So we get in the elevator on the ground floor. First one's in the elevator. We're standing against the back wall, and Bob's standing over here and I'm standing here. We go up a flight or two, and an older trumpet player gets in the elevator. And I see him glance over at Bob, and he glances at me. Now, Bob had a jacket on that was covering his name tag, and my name tag was out. So remember, the guy the elevator door opens. You don't go in immediately. You don't know what's going on in there, right? So he glances at Bob. He glances at me. He comes in. He turns around. He's standing in front of Bob. And elevator doors close, and he turns and he looks at me and he says, "You work at Bob Reeves?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Whatever happened to that guy?" And Bob says, "Oh, the bastard died." and the guy goes, "Huh." And he got off the elevator.
Oh, that's a great story. I like that one. So, if you're thinking kind of globally, in terms of like looking at the history that Bob has had in the industry and the impact that he made, what would be like the one or two big things that you would be able to point to and say, yeah, I think this kind of encapsulates the legacy of Bob Reeves?
Well, if I have to say it in one phrase, I'm going to say he's the greatest mouthpiece maker that's ever lived. But then that doesn't mean other people can't make great mouthpieces. They can. But the reason I make that statement about Bob is not just because of mouthpieces. It's what we alluded to before. He was like one of the first guys on the scene. I mean, there was, Bert Herrick was there, and Carol Purviance, and they did their stuff, and Bob Giardinelli in New York, and other people that aren't coming to mind right now. But Bob came at it from not only a high-end machinist standpoint, but again, solving problems. So he's the first guy that I know of that really started studying and getting into valve alignment. That's a big tool if you're trying to solve people's problems, a huge tool. Bob, having worked with Carol Purviance, from what Bob told me, had incredible ears. And Carol Purviance figured out a lot of things that from science, we know what they were doing now. One of the things was Carol made solid shank mouthpieces, but he had two shank sizes, an A shank and a B shank. And the A shank would now be what Bob Reeves calls a number 4, and the B shank was a number 5. So the 5 would go in a little bit further, a little bit less gap. And people thought that the 5, the B meant Bach. You use this for Bach trumpets and the A for everything else. But Carol thought of it as for Benge trumpets. But the point was, it was a different gap. And Carol heard the difference. And Bob, working with Carol and seeing that and hearing that, said, well, this seems kind of important. And he took it to another level when he developed the sleeve system to be able to adjust the gap, throughout the whole range. And he ran into, along the way, a guy by the name of Bill Cardwell, who was really the scientist that put the final nail in the coffin about how to use science to design trumpets and mouthpieces that play better, easier, and sound better. And he did a lot of collaboration with Cardwell. And I studied the acoustic side of things with Cardwell for about 15 years. And so if you look at Bob's machining skills, the valve alignment, his gap work, and the problem solving thing, all these things really changed the industry. I mean, they really did. And for myself, these are all tools. Adjusting the gap is a tool to help somebody. Doing a valve alignment is a tool. You know, if someone knew Bob and had any amount of conversation with him, they're going to complete the sentence I'm about to say. But Bob used to always say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Sometimes he used different words, but let's just leave it at that, because it was about solving the problem. And you can't have one solution for everybody. And that was one of the reasons Bob would take time to talk to somebody, because you have to, every trumpet player comes at this differently, from their experiences, from who they studied with, from how they feel, their perception of sound. In the beginning, you got to have a conversation and figure out, what do each other mean? If someone says this feels stuffy, what does he really mean? If someone says this is a dark sound, what does he really mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, I've said it a lot that I do believe he's the greatest mouthpiece maker that's ever lived. And, you know, at the beginning of his career, because John Kleiman, Bob studied with John Kleiman, who was, you know, first trumpet at 20th Century Fox for a number of years, 20 years, I think, or something like that. You know, Bob was going to school, LA City College, playing trumpet in the band, doing side jobs, machining, and doing some stuff for John Kleiman, mouthpiece work. And after a while, John Kleiman realized that, hey, this guy knows what's going on. And John Kleiman said to Bob, I think this was 64 or something, he says, hey, what would it cost for you to get the machinery that you really need to really start doing mouthpieces? And Bob said, well, I think about 14 or 1500 bucks to get this Logan lathe. And so John Kleiman wrote him a check right on the spot and said, here, go get that lathe. He says, there's a few old men in this town making mouthpieces, and pretty soon you're going to be the only one left. And depending on how many people you count, back then you had Bert Herrick, you had Carol Proviance, and we can include Dominic Colicchio because he made some mouthpieces, although that he was more of a trumpet guy. So that's where Bob started the business, was with the lathe that John Kleiman gave him the money for, but Bob eventually, you know, paid him back.
Right.
And so it's all this, I kind of lost my train of thought, but it's this inquisitiveness. And well, in the little clip I showed of him, it's okay to be wrong or to make a mistake or think something today, but you learn more and you find out, well, maybe that wasn't so cool. Does that mean that was bad? No, it's what we knew at the time.
Yeah. You know, and that's, I think when you come from the perspective of, like, you know, him being a trained machinist, you know, being in that kind of environment, you know, if you come from a scientific environment, like, you know, growing up with a father who's, you know, a pathologist, you understand that in sciences that there is no absolute. You know, it's like, this is what we know right now, and it's a constant search for a better and deeper understanding of what we think we know. You know, we're looking to, we're constantly testing hypotheses, and the part of that is inherently failure. Yeah, you got to make some mistakes before you kind of dial it in and you figure out what actually needs to happen. And then, you know, obviously as technologies change, you know, like you're talking about cell phones, you know, back then, you know, what we thought was impossible is now commonplace. You know, so as our knowledge and things change, so do our approaches have to change.
Yes. The key part of this that I think is often lost is, in order to see the future or hear the future in this case, you need to understand the past. There's no reason to redo a bunch of science that's been done if it's there. Because the idea with any science, of course, is you find where the prior art is and you start there and try to improve. It's
Right.
the same with trumpet playing. If the greatest trumpet player in the world is this person and you want to be a better trumpet player, you want to start there. That's who you need to, that's who you should always look to, the best players. You know, don't feel good, oh, I'm better than the guy next to me. Okay, great. Are you as good as that guy? And it's not a matter of putting yourself down. It's a matter of trying to strive for something better. Otherwise, why do it?
Yeah.
You know, we could all, I'd be willing to bet all of us could stop making trumpets and mouthpieces. And there's enough trumpets and mouthpieces in the world to keep everyone busy. But the point is, can we do something better? can we work with the player and make it fit them better, you know?
Yeah. Well, like, like you said, at the very beginning of our talk about, think about Bob as like this, trumpet guru that's, in LA, this man, mystery man of knowledge and power. And that's, it's kind of, in some ways, people just, they want to purchase, like, I want to purchase a mouthpiece. But I've seen it more now that people are looking at the mouthpiece as part of a piece of the puzzle, and they're trying to solve that puzzle of how do I become a better player. And as a manufacturer, or as a salesperson, or whatever aspect you're in, you need to be able to answer questions. You need to be able to problem solve. And I know from my own personal experience, like working shows, like it's so important to talk to people and understand what it is that they're looking for, and what they think they're looking for, and learn to kind of get inside their head to figure out then what to give them, how to give them the best advice possible, as opposed to, oh, just buy this. This is my most popular brand, or take this one because it's the one I've got 30,000 of in stock and I need to get rid of it. So it's taking the time to really try to solve the individual's problem. And Bob certainly left a legacy with that, I believe.
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah. He killed a lot of sales by solving someone's problem easily. But it didn't matter because, in the long run, now you've got a customer. Now you've helped somebody. Obviously, anyone who's doing this for a living, you got to make sales or you can't pay the rent, But your goal doesn't have to be to make sales. Your goal can be to raise the bar of trumpet playing, of musicianship, because there have been bad trumpet players that make great music.
That's very true.
Right. And great trumpet players that don't make so great music. So, what do you want? There's value in both. I'd rather hear the good music, but that's me.
Yeah. I'd rather hear a great player making great music.
Oh, there's that too. Yes. That's always the best.
Yeah. That's the best of both worlds. But yeah, I mean, and like you were saying earlier about, that thing that Bob said to you is like, you never know when the light's going to go on. And that's so true. You never know who the next Doc Severinsen or however you want to think about it, who the next really phenomenal trend-setting, bar-setting player is going to be, or the next great educator for that matter. Who's going to be, the person who is on the fence that maybe by helping them with their playing, they're going to become a great educator, and they're going to teach thousands of students who are going to then change the world of music. You just never know. So when you treat everybody like they are the most important person, then, and their problem is the most important problem, then you're doing something for humanity.
Sure, and you feel better about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, and you make $1 million. Well,
I'm still waiting for that part, but I'm still young.
Yeah.
64. I'm still young.
Yeah, come on, we're still young. All right, so Cale, I guess the final question I guess would be, if there is one thing that you would be able to say is like, hey, for the new generation of trumpet mouthpiece manufacturers, because we're always going to have new people that are coming up, what would be the one thing that you would say, if you're going to aspire to be like Bob, this is the lesson you need to pay attention to?
Oh, wow. Well, so here's the good part and the bad part. It's really easy nowadays to learn how to make a trumpet mouthpiece, or something that looks like a trumpet mouthpiece, because we have CNC machining that's much easier to use, much more affordable. We have user-friendly CAD, computer-aided design programs. It's easy to scan existing mouthpieces and, alter them. And within a short period of time and not much training, you got a machine that's spitting out mouthpieces. But it goes back to that Carol Purviance thing. Are you really making and designing a new mouthpiece, you know, even a blind squirrel catches a nut from time to time. And so you can take that, 10,000 monkeys typing on keyboards, and eventually you get Shakespeare approach, which is a shot in the dark approach. I'm guessing, but I think Bob would say you got to study the past. You got to study what's been done, why it was done. And I'm going to say you can't do it with mechanical analysis. The thing that makes acoustics difficult for us to understand is we can't see the sound wave. You can't see it. We can imagine airflow, but we can't see the sound wave. And so you kind of got to, if you're a trumpet player, which seems to be what most of I was a trumpet player first too. And then I want to make mouthpieces, right? Because that guy's got to be making $1 million. So I'm going to make mouthpieces. You got to forget, I know what Bob would say. Bob would say, don't use your own experience as a trumpet player to design mouthpieces, because you're going to design mouthpieces that work good for you. So my definition of a great mouthpiece designer is someone who's designed a diverse line of mouthpieces that cover a very expansive range of sounds, let's say from commercial sounds to more classical sounds, in a large variety of sizes that are all consistent or somewhat consistent in how they play and how they sound. Because that's not easy. Bob certainly did that. There are some mouthpiece lines that one or two of them are really good mouthpieces, but the rest of them aren't. That's the blind squirrel. But if you really have this, it's the same with trumpets. If you have this wide range of designs that give you a lot of sounds and this and that, but are similar, because a Bob Reeves mouthpiece, whether it's a small commercial mouthpiece or one of the classical mouthpieces, has a Bob Reeves sound. They're consistent, and that's what you want. So you got to go for that. And again, you got to start where the art is and take it from there. In my opinion, are there still advances that can be made on the trumpet mouthpiece? Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, like you said, start with what we've got, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but
right.
But we can make it a little bit better as we, more consistent or more, as we take advantage of better understanding of acoustics and metallurgy and all the things that go into it. Yeah, certainly.
But you also, as trumpet players and as designers, and this is a difficult thing, one of my favorite sayings is perfection is the enemy of good enough. But you got to decide where the line of good enough is. That's the hard part. If you're making a rocket nozzle that's got to, take Elon Musk to Mars, that's a different level of good enough than a trumpet mouthpiece. Trumpet mouthpiece got to be made well, but not to that kind of tolerances. So it's where's that line? And that's what you're trying to do. That's what Bob always tried to do. At some point, you got to say, hey, this is good enough. That's the hard part.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good advice, though. Very good advice. All right. So that wraps it up for this episode. And I hope that this time together has given you a little bit of insight into the life of Bob Reeves. I know it certainly has opened my eyes to a lot of the contributions that he has had and the impact that he's had on the industry. So please try to remember that important lesson from Bob, that you never know when the light's going to go on. So everyone that you interact with, be willing to help them, to be a problem solver, and treat them with respect, because you never know the impact that one interaction is going to have on that person who could become the next trendsetter in the trumpet world. So thanks for hanging with me today, and I hope to see you in the next episode.
Peace and slide grease. We out. Thanks for hanging with us today. This podcast is all about creating deeper connections through our mutual love of music and the trumpet life. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast and also like and share this episode with a friend. We want to see the hang grow for show. Please support our sponsors and consider becoming a personal supporter of this podcast as well. Remember, for less than the price of a bottle of valve oil a month, you can keep this podcast moving smoothly. The Trumpet Guru's Hang is recorded at the Candy Factory, a co-working space and social club located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Jose Johnson is the executive producer. Post-production editing is by Mitch Bowers. Our opening theme song was composed and performed by Lexi Signor, and our closing theme music comes courtesy of The Greatest Funeral Ever. Incidental music is by Ethan Swayze and Jose Johnson. Graphic design by Ann Kirby of the Sweet Corps. The Trumpet Guru's Hang podcast is produced in collaboration with the So Good Lancaster Media Group.